So this is getting us into our last unit here before our final, into that 20th century. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen here as we're moving from the Romantic era into the 20th century, into this modernism or this modern time period. So we start to see a big change in music starting at about 1890 and going all the way to 1940. And as we cover this in chapters 20 and 21 here, you're going to find that we have a whole lot of trends, a whole lot of isms, if you will, much more so than when we talked about the classical period and here were the traits, and the romantic period and here were the traits. Music branches off into so many different styles. So we'll touch on each style a little bit so that you understand what the characteristics are. Most of the time, we're just going to look at a key composer because it gets into quite a few different styles here. So from 1890 to 1940, as we're going across the century here, we have a collapse of the Romantic era in many different ways. Most prominent probably is the political aspirations that the Romantic composers had, that the Romantic rulers had, that Romantic society had, really are not coming to fruition. You had a lot of, we talked about last time, you had a lot of wars going on, you had a lot of overtaking going on. Industrialization of countries is accelerating, and that's coming into play too. With all of that, we talked about at the end of the Romantic period a big trend of nationalism, and that's going to continue to grow, and really it climaxes with World War I and II. Artists are responding similar to that Romantic era with that national identity when their country's independence in particular is threatened. Some composers push into bolder forms, like we saw Wagner do with opera, and we also had those composers that were nostalgically trying to look back at what had been, like Brahms. So modernism is a sharp break from that 19th century here. The art is strange, it's different, it's not necessarily new, but it's growing out of the program symphony, it's growing out of the opera, it's growing out of reaction to everything that's going on in society. Technology is increasing at just a dizzying pace here with the telephone, with phonograph. We're going to see that come into play into modern music quite a bit too. Political movement is challenged and changed with the relationship between people and their government. Citizens are increasingly unsettled in the rise of totalitarianism. That was very difficult today, wasn't it? Nazi Germany, great example of this. The fascism in Italy that's happening, the communist growth in the Soviet Union. They all were emphasizing group versus individual, and the national pride, again, trying to protect their national identity, helps grow out of this. We also have a lot of scientific growth, scientific theories that are happening in the late 19th century and that early 20th century. Evolution with Darwin and his ideas. You've got Freud and psychoanalysis going on, sexuality, the loss of order, relativity, Einstein, mathematical equations. There's a lot of different aspects of these discoveries and the growth in the sciences that comes into play in our music too. So varieties of modernism, I guess is what you could call it, this modernist or this modernism moving. So modern music doesn't simply mean that it's contemporary. But modern music is referring to composers or artists who intentionally are putting themselves on the forefront of new developments. Anti-traditionalism or radical experimentation could be a way that you could classify it. And it's not just happening in the music world. It's happening in literature. It's happening in painting. An example of that in music, of course, is how it affects tonality and meter and rhythm. In literature, you have authors such as Joyce coming up with half words or half invented words, or grammar, sentence structure that is not as clear as it used to be on purpose, or the syntax of things. With painters, you've got Picasso, you've got Matisse, You've got lines that are obscured. You've got abstract forms going on. Works that are experimental or push the boundaries, whether we're talking about art, literature, music. A term that you'll see quite often referring to this is avant-garde. So if you're referring to someone as avant-garde or their work is avant-garde, you're saying that their works are experimental or that they're pushing the boundaries of what up until this time have been the norm. Radical, advanced movement in the arts. There's a wave of this that happens in 1890. There's a second wave that we'll see that happens around 1920. Are all modern composers avant-garde? Not necessarily. We have modern composers that are truly just nationalistic in the ways that they're incorporating folk rhythms, folk melodies into their music. We have popular music starting to gain a hold here. We start to see ragtime. We start to see early influence of jazz. We also still see some composers with that romantic spirit, whether it's neoclassicism, we'll move into some impressionism. So avant-garde is more the resistors to maybe those mainstream trends that we're seeing. So the 20th century has many styles. Some of them mix and merge and interact. It's a very colorful tapestry in this period, leading all the way from 1890 up to 1940. With progress, there also comes some uncertainty. With industrialization of a lot of our nations, we find that the poor is getting poorer, the rich are getting richer. We also, with that nationalism, see more of a pride in people's heritage coming through. With the science, the steam power engine, electricity, railroads, automobiles, planes, how are these affecting what's happening with music? One of the main ways is that rural societies who used to be controlled by the aristocrats are now turned into more modern nations when information, travel, the sharing of education is more readily available. So speed is changing things. The speed of which new knowledge travels is changing things very, very quickly. The social change leads to artistic, intellectual movement of modernism. You've got World War II, World War I, so major catastrophes here that happen. You've got progress in science and technology. You've got the industrial poor. You've got the aristocratic rich. I think the distance between those two is growing even more. You also have the development of weapons. If you think about this time period of the late 1800s to 1940, at the start of it, we're talking Civil War time period. Rifles. By the time we get to World War I, we've got tanks, submarines, and by the time we're getting to World War II, we're involving chemical weapons. So there's some growth that isn't so pleasant there. Nations are pitted against each other, especially with that climax with World War II. So avant-garde music, if it's pushing these boundaries and becoming experimental, one thing that you'll notice, especially as we listen to things, people usually have a very distinct reaction whether they appreciate it or like it or not. And that was holding true even at the time that it was being developed or that it was being written and performed. And it causes a little bit of a detachment, I think, between the concert goer or the opera house goer and the composers. There's that separation of the technique or virtuoso versus the technique of the composer. So to some people, they love the welcomeness of getting away from the over-emotional romantic music, and they are challenged by the mathematical thinking, the pushing of the boundaries of this music. Other people see it as dry, unengaging, and cold. They think that it's just schematic and mathematical devices. It's very much the opposite of rubato, where you had a push and pull of meter. But it's also people that are fans of it say it's the way of the future. It's futuristic. We'll talk about some trends here early on. One of them is Impressionism. So with Impressionism, that's probably one of the most well-known modern movements that we hear about. It's mainly coming out of France. It started around 1870. The music was all about color. So where they were pushing the boundaries or being experimental was with color, making color more patches, making harmonies blend into each other so that the melody isn't quite as well defined. The chord changes aren't quite as well defined. They were a lot about tone color or mixing different pairs of instruments to get different types of tone. They wanted things to sound like light or to sound like dark. It's very much imitating the impressionistic movement that we have going on in the painting world, particularly Monet, who used quality of light to give patches of light. Realists, people felt that it was more of a realist movement with it. We also have symbolism. With symbolism, it's more of a conscious, unrealistic movement of doing the opposite of everything that Impressionism is doing. So in poetry or in novels, clustering words together, or in songs that are using speech or vocalists, clustering those words together, making the meaning vague or ambiguous, breaking down harmony, breaking down structure, of freer form. People in that symbolism category tended to be very fascinated with Wagner. And if you think about what we talked about with Wagner's operas, how we lost that format of recitatives and arias, and everything was just running together. Symbolism is coming from there. The third movement that we'll talk about is Expressionism. Expressionism is a German movement. It's about very strong colors in music, very harsh lines, jagged textures, whether you're talking about melody or whether you're talking about rhythm. It literally has a lot of dissonance in it. It has a lot of angst in it. It has a lot of anger in it. Some people called it barbarian. And out of it will grow primitivism. And that's something that we'll talk about with one of our pieces that we'll look at here in this chapter 21 and 22. With the melody, what are we going to hear with these 20th century pieces? Well, you've got leitmotif, people that are going to still continue in what Wagner brought about. They want to make sure that that doesn't confuse the quality of the lines, though, but that it tells the story. Folk music still going to be continued to be used, that nationalistic element, but just like we saw in Mahler, we're going to start to see it distorted, whether it's distorted by rhythm or distorted by taking it to a different major or minor mode. Music itself is going to become a little bit more complex. I think it makes less sense to the listener and it makes more sense to the theorist studying it on page to see how it's actually put together. Intense rhythm, bigger intervals, dissonant intervals, anguished intervals, melodies that don't have a clear tone or a tune that is hard to pick out, and fragments with no emotion is another quality of this 20th century music that we'll see. As far as scales, we move away from, again, just strictly being diatonic with major or minor or chromatic, because again, they're trying to blur those lines or push the envelope of what tonality is. So we see a pentatonic scale. We've talked about that a couple times, that pentatonic being an all black key scale if you're looking at the piano. We see whole tone scales, which makes all the intervals a whole step or larger than a diatonic scale, which is partly half and partly whole steps. What's unique about your whole tone scale is that it divides the octave into equal parts, and so it sounds ambiguous. You can't, as we've done before, we've listened and we've said, sing what you think the home pitch is. It's really hard to hear what that home pitch is. Octatonic is using the first 8 pitches in an octave and alternating between whole and half steps. Again, it takes away that home pitch. It takes away that sense of tonality. We're also going to see serialism, which devises its own scale. We'll talk about this with Schoenberg in just a few minutes. Serialism is taking a scale, deciding what the order of those 8 pitches are going to be, and then always using the pitches in that specific order over and over again. So again, it's a mathematical equation that's controlling the form of your piece, not the melody or how the melody is going to be shaped or how the harmony is going to shape above it. All of these things, I think, really help lead to the emancipation of dissonance. The melodies are more complex, they're more fragmented, they're more vague, the harmonies overall are more dissonant, and that all leads us to find more and more pieces that we're going to start to describe as atonal. So if we're saying that a piece is atonal, we're saying that it's really free of consonance or dissonance. There's no home pitch. There's nowhere that it needs to be leading to. So in the next part of the lecture, we're going to take a look at Debussy and Stravinsky and Schoenberg, and we'll take a look at some of these trends in a little bit closer way.